Let us go to the first lecture, which is sentence structure and sentence types. And we'll spend about 20 minutes here going through this. So hopefully you guys have printed this out and have these with you. You can make some notes as necessary. What I'm wanting to give you here is a very, very, very brief overview of different sentence types and then how elements of sentences can fit together to create the sentence types. So I'm going to give you some definitions, some working definitions here to help us along the way. I'm going to use the word constituent a lot. What is a constituent? A constituent is an element within the hierarchy of a sentence filling a grammatical function slot. So sentences are made of words and phrases, and those words and phrases can fill grammatical function slots. And so that brings up the question, what's a function slot? And this is the various grammatical ways that nouns or nominals, which are anything that functions as a noun, and verbs can function in a sentence. So if we take a sentence like boy meets girl, right? That's one of your examples here. Jeremiah wows us. These both have the same grammatical structure. And in each of them respectively, boy and Jeremiah are filling the same function slot, aren't they? Their function slot is the subject function slot. So boy is the subject, Jeremiah is the subject of wows. Girl and us are both filling the same function slot of direct object, and then the verbs, meets and wows, are both filling the verb function slot. Now, when we talk about verbs, there's really three categories for verbs that are important. Transitive is one type of way of describing a verb. And when a verb's transitive, it is going to take a direct object. So transitive verbs take direct objects. Intransitive verbs don't, right? They can't take a direct object, or they don't take a direct object. So we have two sentences here. Jack killed the giant using the verb kill, and then the giant died using the verb die. The verb killed takes a direct object, right? What's the direct object here? I can't hear you.
Giant.
Yes, giant. So Jack acted upon, by way of killing activity, the giant. The giant is affected by the action. It's the direct object here. And so the verb kill is transitive, right? But when I say the giant died, the verb to die cannot take a direct object. And so this would be labeled as intransitive. Is that clear?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. Sometimes this is where it can get a little bit tricky. A verb can be either transitive or intransitive, depending on its use and conception. So if we take an example like I ate a bear, ate is transitive there. I've got an object, right? Have you eaten? Somebody asks that question. The verb have eaten is intransitive here. So there's no concern as to what has been eaten as much as whether the activity of eating and one's tummy is full, whether that has been achieved. Another example would be something like to run. Jack ran yesterday. Okay, so he's an athlete. He runs daily. Jack ran yesterday. Is that transitive or intransitive? It is intransitive. Yesterday is not the object, right? He's not acting upon yesterday as an entity. It's just telling you when he ran. Okay. If I omit yesterday, Is the sentence still grammatical? Jack ran. Yeah, nothing wrong with that sentence, right? If a verb is transitive and it takes a direct object and I drop the direct object, then that usually creates some problems for me. It sounds like a funny sentence, right? So if I say Jack killed, it's incomplete. You're wondering, what did he kill? But if I said Jack died, you're not waiting for an object because you don't expect one with that verb, right? So Jack ran yesterday. Ran is intransitive. But there are transitive uses of this verb as well. Jack ran a race. So here, race is the direct object, and there the use of ran is transitive in that example, but not in the first one. All right. Now, if any of you have taken the English refresher course, some of this may be familiar. All right, linking verbs are also called copular verbs, copulas, or copulatives. These are neither transitive nor intransitive, but they predicate or assert something about the subject. The identity of a subject, the quality of it, the classification of the subject, the location of the subject. So the most common linking verb in English is the verb to be, and all its attendant forms: is, are, was, were. Okay, so Carl is quirky. I'm predicating something about Carl, and this is a predication of his quality, right? Carl is quirky. Bess was a cow. Here I'm classifying Bess. I'm telling you what category Bess belongs to. So Bess was a cow means Bess was in the category of things known as cow. Now, many other verbs are linking verbs, and they serve to predicate something about the subject. And these are usually verbs of perception. So in addition to be in English, we have verbs like to appear, to seem, to become, to look, or to sound. These are considered linking verbs as well. So look at our examples here. These are saying something roughly like Carl is quirky, but with a different verb, with a different nuance. Okay, so I can say Carl is quirky, but I can also say Carl appears quirky, right? Carl seems quirky. Carl becomes quirky. Carl looks quirky. And Carl sounds quirky. And in all of these, quirky is an adjective indicating something about Carl. I'm predicating something about Carl here, his quirkiness. But by using these other linking verbs, I'm adding the additional nuance of either sight or sound or appearance, something like that. All right. Now, just to draw a little bit of a finer point on this, take the verb to appear. Okay. It can also be an intransitive verb, not a linking verb, but an intransitive verb. The verb to appear can also mean to become visible, like out of nowhere, as in Carl appeared. All right, what does that mean? That means Carl showed up, right? Is the verb appeared in this example serving as a linking verb?
No.
No, because I'm not giving you any quality of Carl related to what he's like, right? I'm just telling you what he did. And so if appeared is not a linking verb, but an intransitive verb, then I can use not an adjective, but an adverb. Carl appeared quirkily. Does that mean that Carl is himself quirky?
No.
No. Quirkily is not an adjective, it's an adverb. And it's telling you not about Carl, but about the verb appearing. His manner of appearing was quirky. But when I say Carl appears quirky and I use an adjective here, there I'm not telling you about the verb appear, I'm telling you about the subject Carl, right? Carl is quirky based on that sentence. Whereas in Carl appeared quirkily, the appearance is being described as quirky. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. So whenever I have a linking verb, I'm going to have a subject. I'm going to have a verb that's, I'll just do LV here for linking verb. There always has to be something else that comes that tells me what the subject is, appears to be, sounds like, becomes. Okay. When the verb is truly a linking verb, there has to be two parts there. So usually it's an adjective, but it could be a prepositional phrase. And it could be a noun as well, right? Bess is a cow, for example. All right, more about that later. The term obligatory in linguistics means that some constituent is required given the semantic structure. And when that constituent is obligatory for the verb to be used in a sentence that's proper or well-formed, that doesn't sound incomplete, an obligatory constituent is often described in grammar and linguistics as a complement. Okay, so if we find a phrase that's a complement, that means you can't remove it and still retain a grammatical sentence. So take transitive verbs, right? Transitive verbs take direct objects and they need that direct object to be grammatical. Look at the sentence here. I give you, I viewed. If I just looked at you and said, I viewed, what would you think? Something's missing, right? Not complete. That sentence doesn't sound grammatical. It sounds funny. And it's because viewed is conceived of as a transitive verb, and transitive verbs require direct object. Okay, so if I'm missing it, it's not grammatical. That means that the direct object is obligatory with a verb like to view. And that means whatever the object is, that obligatory thing is a complement. So we would say that if I had a sentence like, I viewed the picture is the complement of the verb to view. It's a required constituent. All right. If I had a sentence that contains an indirect object, then I would have a direct object that's obligatory as well, and the indirect object would be obligatory. In other words, all sentences with indirect objects require direct objects too. So here is our baseline sentence. I gave John a wedgie. All right. I gave John a wedgie. What are the parts here? I is the subject. Gave is the verb. John is the indirect object. And wedgie is the direct object. The wedgie is what I gave. John is the one I gave it to, right? Everybody see that? Let me get rid of that mistake there. Okay, so let's say for a verb like to give, I drop the direct object. And I just said, I gave John. Does that sound grammatical? No, that didn't sound good at all, right? If I said, I gave a wedgie, let's say I dropped the indirect object and just left the direct object. How would I gave a wedgie sound?
Makes sense. It would not, no, it wouldn't make sense. I don't.
Exactly. That doesn't work either, right? What does that tell us? It tells us that with a verb like to give, indirect objects and direct objects are obligatory, aren't they? They're both complements of that verb. Okay.
All right, Marshall, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
What if you have context before the sentence? So, I'm just changing the direct object there. I gave John a present. If you just said I gave a present, that would fit in another sentence, and so you still wouldn't need that indirect object, right?
Yeah. There are situations where in the discourse, the prior sentence might contain, say, the indirect object such, and it's so active in the discourse that repeating the indirect object isn't absolutely required. So if I said something like, hey, Martha, what did you give John for his birthday? She might answer, I gave a motorcycle. And then the to John is omitted because was just mentioned, right? So I would say in that case, it's implied based on the construction. It's easily recoverable because it's so active in the discourse. Yeah. Now, when we have constituents that are not obligatory, then they are called adjuncts. And we need to know these two words, adjuncts and complements. Complements are obligatory based on what a verb means, and adjuncts are not obligatory. And these can be omitted. And they usually tell us additional things about a verbal action like time, place, or manner. But they're not inherently involved in the verb's semantic structure. That is to say, when I take a verb like give and I say, okay, think about the act of giving, no matter what we're talking about, you should conceive of three things, right? A giver, who would be the subject, a thing given, who would be the object, and a recipient of the giving. That would be your indirect object, right? Those are the three things that should always hop into your mind when you hear that verb give. And so we refer to that as the verb semantic structure. Structurally, there needs to be three things. But does giving, when I evoke that idea, does the time of giving occur to you as something necessary about using that verb?
No.
No. What about where somebody gives somebody something? No. Right? So take a look at our example here. I gave John a wedgie last night in the copier room. Now, I just want to make a disclaimer. There is nothing autobiographical about any of these. Okay? All right. So I gave John a wedgie last night in the copier room. Last night is an adjunct phrase. That is, it's not obligatory. And in the copier room is an adjunct prepositional phrase. And it's not obligatory either. They're both very interesting bits of information. I would certainly like to have been there when it happened. But they're not obligatory constituents, okay? And should we omit one of those adjuncts, there would be absolutely nothing ungrammatical about the sentence that's left, okay? So I could say I gave John a wedgie in the copier room. Fine and dandy. It may not be according to OSHA rules and all that, but okay, I gave John a wedgie in the copier room. I could say I gave John a wedgie last night, right? So I've omitted the other adjunct. I could omit both adjunct constituents. I gave John a wedgie, period, right? And all of those are perfectly grammatical sentences. But if I drop one of the complements I gave John, that doesn't sound right. And if I say, if I drop the indirect object, I gave a wedgie, that doesn't sound right. Okay. We need complements. Adjuncts are not obligatory. All good?
Dr. Marshall, if an adverb were to be stuck in there, would it be a constituent, or would you just label it an adverb and kind of move on?
Yeah, adverbs are adjuncts.
But they're
Because
not-
for the most part, adverbs are not required grammatically. So phrases is the next item that we want to talk about. So we've been talking about constituents, and constituents are things that fill function slots in a sentence. The question is what sort of things can be a constituent? And what we see here is that constituents can be, as we've seen, single words, but they can also consist of larger units of things that hang together and function as a single thing. And those are clauses, or excuse me, at the highest level clauses, but at a more intermediate level phrases. So I've given you an example here in the sentence, John stole a kiss. John stole a kiss. We have several constituents here, right? John is the subject, and he fills that subject slot, and he is nothing more than an individual noun. But we could put a phrase in the position that the noun slot fills. And so if we have a noun that is no longer just a single noun, but a noun phrase, it's a larger unit still functioning more or less as a noun. We could use something like the Black Knight, and we replace the word John with the word the Black Knight, and then we have the Black Knight stole a kiss. Now that I'm thinking about it, I probably should have used the proper noun. What's his name? Bruce. Bruce stole a kiss. And then the Black Knight might have some reference to the same thing. But when I wrote this, I wasn't even thinking about Batman, because I don't think I'd even seen the Dark Knight Batman movies. Yes, I was alive back then. Okay, now the subject could be a larger unit, not just a phrase like the Black Knight, but maybe an adjective and a prepositional phrase attached. So we could have something like this: the pathetic poor Black Knight of the Round Table of King Arthur stole a kiss. Now these are varying constituent sizes of increasing complexity, but what are they all doing? They're all filling a single function slot, right? All of these are the subject of the verb stole. And one of the interesting and neat things about language is that it has what's called a recursive nature. I'll write the word recursive. You don't need to know that for this class, but it is used frequently in discussions of language and linguistics. Recursive means that there's the possibility of it going on and on and on infinitely. In other words, I could talk about the boy. Then I could say, okay, let me add an adjective, the happy boy. Well, let me add another adjective, the tall happy boy. I'll add another adjective. And what I can do is I can keep adding an element and never stop. And I would have a new sentence every time I add an element inside the noun phrase here, and it creates a recursive structure. What it indicates to us is that the set of sentences in a language are infinite, right? Like I could just keep on adding adjectives and start making them up when I get to the end of all the adjectives I have in the English language, or add the adjectives in a new way, in a different order, and so forth. Relative clauses do this, right? I could say, the man who came to dinner is my father. Then I could say, well, I could further modify the word dinner with a relative clause. The man who came to the dinner that John cooked was my father. But then I could modify John with a relative clause. The man who came to the dinner that John, who is my brother, cooked is my father. And I can just keep adding things and create a new sentence each time. And it shows us that through the recursive function of language, the number of sentences is infinite. And you might be sitting there going, why in the world do people sit around dark tables in dark rooms smoking cigars talking about this sort of thing? Well, the reason is that when linguists were trying to figure out what's the best way to describe language and how do we understand language, what they noticed is that children learn how to acquire language without ever learning the rules, right? You ever notice that? Your kids, if you have them, they start learning language without ever sitting in a grammar class. And for the most part, by the time they're 3 or 4, they actually have most of the rules of the human language already intact, such that they can create some amazing sentences. And some people used to think, well, the only reason a kid can use language well is because they've heard what they're using. They've heard good sentences. They've heard those sentences, and they're just repeating the sentences that they've heard. But the fact of the matter is, you can tell a child a sentence that he's never heard, and by the time he's 3 or 4, he fully understands it, understands the grammar of it. It makes sense, right? And a sentence that has never been uttered before in the presence of the child, a child can utter, having never heard it, and it can be a perfectly good, complicated sentence grammatically. And what that shows us is that kids are learning grammatical structures. Those are the rules of grammatical structure without ever being taught them. They imbibe them from the sentences they hear, and their minds are abstracting the rules and then applying them in new situations. So it's a pretty interesting thing about language acquisition, and we wish that you guys learned Hebrew as easily as your children are learning English, but for some reason that doesn't happen. It would be nice though if you just came, listened to me talking, and walked out speaking Hebrew, right? And creating new sentences. That'd be awesome. Okay, let's see. Let's look at the chart here, and this should demonstrate the difference between single nouns functioning as constituents and then whole phrases, noun phrases, functioning as constituents. So what I've given you are different function slots that nouns can take. So subject being the first one, since usually that comes first in an English sentence. We have men killed aliens here, right? So one word, a single noun fills that subject slot. But then I could take a phrase and just plug that phrase in where the single noun was. The men in black killed aliens. Okay. The direct object slot could be filled by a single constituent. So I could say aliens killed men. So men's the object of killed. Or I could put a whole noun phrase here. Aliens killed the men in black. And then the object of the preposition is usually a slot that a noun can fill. So I could say the sons of men. So of is my prep, right? And men is my object of the preposition. The sons of men killed aliens. And then I could expand men into a phrase. The sons of the men in black killed aliens. So I can plug in larger and larger types of phrases to fill those function slots. And what we're going to see is that it isn't just phrases, but whole clauses that can fill a function slot also, right? And we'll get to that in the next handout. Okay, so what the rest of this handout does is it gives you a typology of sentence types that you can use and think about when you're analyzing sentences. And this is going to be rather important for you when it comes to diagramming, because when you diagram, you've got a diagram with the type of sentence you have in mind. Now, just by a show of hands, let me switch my view here on the screen. How many of you have actually engaged in sentence diagramming in Greek already? Go ahead and raise your hand, and let me see. You're nice and high because you're all small, tall, tiny little boxes on my screen, and I'm all the way in the back of the room. Okay, how many of you have done sentence diagramming in English? Okay, good. All right. So most of you have some familiarity with the basic concept. I'm going to illustrate basic diagramming for these basic sentence types. But for us, the challenge is that all of our diagramming is done from left to right, if we've encountered it before, right? So the subject and the verb go in this order. But Hebrew is a right to left language. And so we're going to be doing our diagram in the other direction. All right. So some sentences are simply SV sentences, subject verb. SV stands for subject verb. And what that means, now using the terms that we talked about last class earlier in the handout, we're talking about an intransitive verb, aren't we? The verb is intransitive here. So examples could be Jesus wept, where wept is a verb that doesn't take a direct object. Peter slept, and the leper leapt. Lots of rhyming going on there. So in an abstract way, we could model the sentence type in terms of its diagramming structure like this, where you have a baseline and a line that actually intersects. So it goes all the way through. The subject goes on the right and the verb goes on the left. Okay. And so if I were doing a Hebrew sentence, and I'm putting these English words in the Hebrew order just to exemplify that, Jesus first, and then wept is on the other side of that intersecting line there on the baseline. Now, what you're going to see here is that these are obligatory constituents in the sentence type, right? Subject, verb. An intransitive verb doesn't require an object, so I won't have a slot for an object in this type of a sentence. But intransitive verbs do require a subject, and that subject will have its own slot on the baseline. Things that are not obligatory don't go on the baseline. They'll go usually under the baseline as modifiers. So let's look at the second. We have SVDO, so subject, verb, direct object. And these sorts of verbs then are not intransitive but transitive because they can take an object. I eat butter, which is autobiographical. Jesus healed sinners, and Martha burned the soup. All of these share the same structure. Notice I could have a pronoun as the subject or a full noun, right? And as you've seen, I could have a noun phrase. It could be not just Jesus healed sinners, but the Savior healed sinners, and the Savior would be a phrase and not merely a single word. We would diagram these in this way. The first part is exactly the same as the SV sentence, but what we're doing is we're simply adding, right? The direct object, you will draw a line that stops on the baseline here. Does not go through, doesn't intersect, and then the direct object will be to the left of the verb. So I eat butter is
Hey, Dr. Marshall.
like that. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, Isaac.
No, it's fine.
I think you mentioned this, but just for my clarity, we're doing this kind of right to left. Is that because of Hebrew, like how the Hebrew language is, we're following the order of that?
Yes. We're doing it right to left because of the Hebrew order.
Okay, whereas like English or Greek, you'd be going left or right.
Yep.
Dr. Marshall, I also had a question here on this story. This is Zach. I know you're going to get to this later, so I don't want to jump on the gun too quick. But as far as the article with like the soup and the leper, does that belong in the same? So I guess for the example we're on now, does that belong in the same slot as the direct object? Is the article?
Yes. I'm going to put it in the same slot as the direct object here. In our our line diagramming in grammar school, the articles went underneath, or I don't know if you guys remember that, but they go underneath. But for two reasons, for the sake of simplicity, so we don't clutter up the diagrams, I'll keep the article with the noun it modifies. And secondly, in Hebrew, that article is going to be attached inseparably anyway, right?
Thank you.
All right, very good. Now, just a terminological comment here. For SVDO sentences, sometimes you'll see if you're reading other people's works and they're talking about sentence types as well, or sentence patterns. Type and pattern mean the same thing, but just to clarify one thing, sometimes I'll ask you what type of sentence are we looking at, and what I mean by that is not what sentence type, like SV, SVDO, that sort of thing, but rather, is it a verbal clause or is it a verbless clause? Is it one where the verb to be is missing? So just be aware, when I ask what type of sentence we're looking at, I might mean what sentence type, as in give me the label for the pattern, but probably more often than not, what I'm asking is it a null copula clause? Is it a clause where the copula is missing, i.e. it's a verbless clause, or is it a verbal clause? Okay, so there is going to be some ambiguity there as we analyze sentences. So sentence types and sentence patterns, though, are talking about which letters we use. And so SVDO here is what I'm using. Some refer to these as SVO, where the word O just stands for object, and it's assumed that it's a direct object if it's this type of sentence. So be aware that you might see that sort of labeling also. Now for C, we have SVIO and DO. And here, the IO stands for indirect object and DO stands for direct object. The V stands for verb. And that kind of verb is always going to be transitive. Why? Why is the verb transitive in an SVIODO sentence?
Because you have a direct object.
Exactly. Because there's a direct object, the verb must be transitive, right? Because there's a direct object, the verb must be transitive. And so the direct object, as in the B section over here, is it obligatory or not? Is it a complement or an adjunct?
Complement?
Yes. The direct object in the sentence as in B is a complement, right? It's required. If I say Jesus healed and I don't say sinners, then I feel like there's something incomplete. If I say Martha burned, but I don't say the soup, then you're waiting for the object to come, because to you, the verb doesn't sound complete yet in its semantic structure until that object arrives. And so the same thing is true with SVIODO sentences. But the verb is of a particular sort where I'm going to have three things that sort of swirl around the verb's semantics, a doer, an object, and then a recipient. Okay, so as an example, the verb to give is one that is going to use a subject, verb, indirect object, direct object type of structure. I gave John butter. I gave John butter. If I left the word butter off and just said I gave John, we feel like that sentence is grammatically incomplete, right? And if I leave the indirect object off, but the verb give is one that requires an object and a recipient, if I leave the indirect object off, it also sounds odd. I gave butter without specifying to whom. That's incomplete. All right. So I'm going to put the indirect object on the baseline, but there's some liberty here about where we put it. And in this sense, and this is really the only place where this happens, the ordering of constituents in English will map onto, or excuse me, the ordering of the constituents in Hebrew could map onto the ordering in the baseline. But if I can go back to B, that's not the case here. We're going to put the subject first, no matter where in Hebrew it goes. And we're going to put the direct object here on our diagram, no matter which order it comes in Hebrew. So sometimes direct objects can be first in the sentence in Hebrew. The Hebrew sentence might say something like, my wife I have loved, or Jacob I loved, right? Where Jacob is the object. Well, I'm gonna put Jacob over here and I over here and loved in the middle on my diagram. This is really the only place where I might have a little variation here in terms of putting the direct object first or the indirect object first. Now, what do we notice about this? As we're reading from right to left, the direct object always has this line that's perpendicular to the baseline, and then the direct object. So that's true even if we put it last, right? So what's marking the indirect object? It's this slanted line that's slanting away from the verb. Okay. The indirect object has a line slanting away from the verb, but not fully intersecting the baseline. It stops on the baseline.
Dr. Marshall,
Yeah.
could I ask you on those SVDO sentences? I mean, I guess it could apply to any of them really, but Jesus healed sinners, that example.
Mm-hmm.
And saying that, okay, the direct object is a complement because if you just had Jesus healed, period, doesn't make sense. But is there times where like this ingrammatical sentence out of context becomes grammatical in context because you could imply what Jesus was healing?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just, is that right? Or is that just always?
Yeah, no. If you recall, I think last class we might have talked about this. I don't think,
Okay.
I can't remember. It might have been in my Sunday school class. We might have been talking about this too. So I apologize if I'm assuming it was last class. But yes, there are certain contexts in which an object might be omitted because it was immediately stated right before and can be easily recoverable, right? So what did you give John last night? I gave a wedgie, right? Where I leave John off because his role as the indirect object recipient's already highly salient, right? It's there. It's in my mind. It's already presupposed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And in other contexts, a verb could be transitive in one use and intransitive in another. And I think that we did talk about this last week. So I could say, Billy ran, and there that's an intransitive use of run. But I could also have a sentence that on the surface takes a direct object, like Billy ran his race to the end, right? So his race is the object of run there.
Okay.
Even sleep, right? And I say I slept, that's intransitive. But I could also use an expression like, Edgar slept the sleep of death. So there he slept the sleep. That's in structure a direct object.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I gave John butter. Here, John is my indirect object. So that's what's new to the sentence pattern. I gave John butter. So John's the recipient. I'm going to put that either here with the slanting line away from the verb or here if I want to put the direct object first. Now, in my English sentence, since John comes first, I'm going to be more inclined to put John first there. All right. You might be wondering, when would it be advisable to put the, the indirect object in one place versus another? Here's an example. Let me just rephrase the first sentence. I gave the butter. Can I just say I gave the butter, John? What am I missing here?
Preposition.
Exactly. So did you know that there is a kind of rule in our grammatical structure in English that requires a preposition with the indirect object if it goes after the verb? I'm sorry, if it goes after the object, and not so if it goes before. So I gave the butter to John, right? Or I gave John the butter. Can we say I gave to John the butter? Does that sound natural to you?
Sounds wooden.
Yeah. There's something that at least it sounds awkward, right? We could use it, and I don't think anybody would accuse us of being fully ungrammatical, but it would be questionable, right? But if I left it off in the second sentence and I said I gave the butter John, you wouldn't just say that's awkward, would you? You would say that's definitely not the way we do it. And then we would ask, like, what? Are you from Mississippi or are you from Alabama? I'm just kidding. We would only ask, are you from Alabama? I say that as somebody who grew up in Mississippi. So Alabama, that's where all the weirdos were. In Mississippi, we spoke the purest form of English, as everybody knows. Okay, so
Dr. Marshall,
yes.
I have a question. So on the handout, it's showing that there's like a drop down in the baseline for the indirect object. And then even in the GASMIC, like under page like 98, under section E, it's showing that, and it's also showing the slant in an opposite direction. Is there kind of a discretion in which you want to diagram it, or is it one way or the other? Because it seems like there's a little bit of a confusion.
Yeah, where are you saying on my handout? I have
So on your handout, I have it printed out, and it shows that it to drop down from the baseline with a slant towards the right.
He has the old one. That's the 2017 version.
Yeah, I think you're looking at an old handout.
I see.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I emailed you guys this 2022 version because I did make some modifications. Yeah,
that might make sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're stuck in the wrong century.
I don't know.
No, I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, it raises a good question, because I did ask you to read GRASMIC, but also to understand that there's some tweaking of GRASMIC. But the basics, GRASMIC's explanations of why we diagram and more or less how are very good foundations, right? So you will find some folks that do the indirect object this way: subject, verb, direct object, and the indirect object is down here. All right. And if somebody is learning or has already learned how to diagram using GRASMIC's model, I'm not going to begrudge you the joy of continuing to use that. As long as you're following a structure that actually makes sense. This does make sense at some level, especially because much of the time in English, indirect objects come in the form of the word to someone, right? And And that is technically a prepositional phrase, and we usually put prepositional phrase under the baseline. Here's what what's driven me to go back, because I started with this type of structure when I first started teaching line diagramming. Then I switched to this one, and then I switched back to this one. So what made me switch back? There's two things. Number one, Waymeyer does it like I've given you at the top here. Secondly, it does seem to me like obligatory constituents should be on the baseline. And an indirect object is an obligatory constituent. Okay. And it seems to me that modifiers are the things that should hang off of the baseline. And modifiers are, as a general rule, adjuncts. They're not obligatory. In other words, if you omit the modifiers, you still got a basic sentence type, right? So like, if I could, add an adjective here, an adverb here, a preposition and an object of the preposition over here, right? Then what sort of a sentence could I have? I could have something like, the happy boy sweetly gave to Jesus a puppy dog with 3 tails. All right. If I drop the modifiers that are hanging down the baseline, then it would be, the boy gave Jesus a puppy dog, right? If I delete this other thing hanging off, I've deleted one of the obligatory complements, right? The boy gave a puppy dog, and then who he gave it to is unstated, and it's incomplete. So I say that to say, it should theoretically be, just for consistency's sake, at least to me, should theoretically be the case that all things hanging up the baseline should probably be adjuncts and just merely modifiers. And that's why I think it advisable to shove that indirect object back up on the baseline.
Dr. Marshall, do you happen to know if the lectures from Smedley Yates there in Arizona, which are on YouTube, which model does he follow?
I don't know what Smedley Yates does.
Okay.
I can guess that since Smedley is an upstanding and fine man, that he must follow me and Waymeyer. But I really don't know. I really don't know. That'd be a good question, though, if anybody wants to shoot him a note and ask, where do you put your indirect objects on a baseline? I'd be curious to know. But I did want to achieve some consistency between what you're learning in Greek and what you're learning here. So that was another reason to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. So Martha made Jesus a meal. Traditionally, these sorts of sentences have also been described as subject, verb, indirect object, direct objects. I'm going to quibble with this a little bit later. I could quibble with it now, but I'm not 100% convinced that in a sentence like this, Jesus is truly an indirect object. Because I'm not certain that Jesus is obligatory in a sentence like this. For the most part, indirect objects semantically, so I'll just put here semantically, equal the recipient. And in the sentence like Martha made Jesus a meal, I don't think that Jesus is literally the recipient of make. because making doesn't really involve the transference of something, one thing to another place, right? Recipient usually involves that there's some sort of idea of movement, either literally or metaphorically, movement from one to another. I would suggest that in this sentence, Jesus is semantically a beneficiary, right? Beneficiary. All right. That is, Martha made a meal, and Martha made a meal for the benefit of Jesus. Now, why would I belabor that? Well, if I dropped, may I not be struck down for this, okay? If I dropped, obviously we're talking about Jesus here, okay? If Martha made Jesus a meal, by the way, do you guys know my Jesus story and my engagement?
No.
Oh, I've never told you this. Okay. Let me just give you on the side here real quick. Okay. My wife will be delighted to know that in the week of my anniversary, we will be celebrating 28 years this Saturday. When we got engaged, I took her to the Nutcracker in the Los Angeles area. Actually, it was down in Long Beach. And we had really nice time. It was Christmas, around Christmas time. So the Nutcracker was playing. So we went and saw the ballet. And then afterwards, we went to the Queen Mary, very famous boat that used to cross the Atlantic all the time. And it's permanently harbored in Long Beach Harbor. And so we went there. We were going to just get a little bite to eat. And I had my ring in my pocket the whole time. And so when we got seated at our table, I excused myself to go to the bathroom, but found out who the waiter was. And I handed him the ring inside the little thing. And I said, okay, we're going to order something. When you bring it out, I want you to bring it out covered on a plate. And when you put the plate down, then lift the cover off and have the ring open right there. And so I gave a complete stranger my ring. And for the next 15 minutes, I'm sweating, hoping that Jesus was going to come back. And his name was Jesus, and Jesus showed up and delivered the ring, and we've been certainly bound at the hip ever since. But yeah, it was really hoping Jesus would come through there. Anyhow, so Martha made Jesus a meal, right? If I dropped Jesus or Jesus, then it would just be Martha made a meal. Is that a fully and completely grammatical sentence?
Yes.
Yes, it is. It is, right? So when I say and put examples like this in subject, verb, indirect object, direct object type of category, I am sort of doing that with my fingers crossed. Just because even though I quibble over this, most people don't. And most people will use examples like this as indirect objects. Okay, so I just want you to be aware of that. I think this is probably the case even with Williams Hebrew syntax. So just to put one fine point on it. Take a sentence like sold. Okay. So I could say something like Mike sold the car to Billy. All right. By the way, can I just make one comment, one observation? The Martha made Jesus a meal. If I did want to put Jesus after the word meal, could I just say Martha made a meal Jesus? It wouldn't mean the same thing, right? So I do, even on these sorts of beneficiary types of indirect objects, if we want to call that an indirect object, I've got to put preposition there, right? Martha made a meal for Jesus. And we use the word for and not to, don't we? She didn't make a meal to Jesus, but she made a meal for Jesus because that is the beneficiary semantic role. Now, that's going to be relevant here in just a minute. So Mike sold the car to Billy. Mike's the subject, right? Sold's the verb. What's the car? Direct object, good. And is to Billy, on my understanding, is it an indirect object or not? It is. It is. By virtue of this activity, Billy comes into possession of a car, right? So he is the recipient of that. All right. Now, if I add, let's say Mike has a brother named Lance, okay? Mike sold the car to Billy for Lance. Now, what semantic role does Lance have here? Is he the indirect object?
The beneficiary.
Oh, he's simply the beneficiary, right? Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that the beneficiary role is not a complement, right? It's an adjunct. When I talk about giving, selling, or whatever, there's nothing inherently about that that makes me wonder who the beneficiary is. That's just additional information that's added for whatever reason, but it's not obligatory information. I don't expect that whenever those verbs are used, right?
So Dr. Marshall, with that being not obligatory, when you're diagramming that, would you put that phrase for Lance under the verb, or would you put that?
Yes.
Okay.
It would go under the verb.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I were diagramming this, then it would look something like this, right? M sold. Then I could do to Billy here, and then the car, right? And then that would be for Lance.
Dr. Marshall, so when we're translating this from Hebrew into English, is that preposition that we're putting in there to and for, is that always going to be what we see in the Hebrew? Will there ever be a time where we just kind of go rogue and implement that ourselves, or just that's implied in the Hebrew and we add that in our English translation?
Yeah, so what's going to happen in Hebrew is you're going to see with these the preposition lamed, right, le, or the preposition el, right? Those will be the prepositions that mark indirect objects. Now, in Greek, you could have a preposition, or you could just have a noun in the dative case, and there won't be a preposition at all.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now we're doing all of these examples in English just because it's a lot easier, I think, to get the diagramming concepts by using what you're most familiar with to learn the hard stuff, and then once you've got that, then we'll then add the Hebrew. We'll layer the Hebrew element on. Okay. So sometimes you will come across people who will simply label a sentence like this as subject, verb, object, object. And what that means is that there's two objects here in this sort of a sentence, an indirect object and a direct object. There are other sorts of sentences that take two objects as well, but one's not an indirect object. And that's why, for me, I'm leaving the IO and DO there to clarify what I'm talking about here. Now, with the sentence here in D, we have a subject, verb, subject, complement. Now, in parentheses, this is not part of the sentence pattern. This is just telling you something about what type of SC we're dealing with. So what does SC stand for? This stands for subject complement, and the verb is a linking verb or a copular verb. So verbs like be, all right? And so what I mean by an or pp is that an adjective, a noun, or a prepositional phrase could be the thing that fills the subject complement slot. Now, there are some other terms besides SC or subject complement that some grammarians use. So you can refer to it as a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective, depending on whether the subject complement is an adjective or a noun. Let me see here. I don't think I give you this term, but I probably should because you're going to see it. Some will also refer to this as a copular complement because the verb is a copular verb. So the complement is a complement of that copular verb. So whenever we have a sentence like this, and I've given you 3 examples here. Excuse me, I've given you 4 examples here. You are beautiful, right? I've got a subject, a verb, and then here in this case, the subject complement's an adjective. You are a woman. Here the subject complement is a noun. But we are the world. You remember that old monstrosity of a song. The subject complement is a noun. And then Frodo is in the Shire. Here, in the Shire is neither a noun nor an adjective, right? It's a prepositional phrase. Now we'll talk about how to diagram these things like prepositional phrases that are more complicated. But for the simple ones, we have a subject and a verb as always. But notice that I've got a line that's slanted and stopping on the baseline and the subject complement here, but it's slanting in the other direction. Okay, so the way that slanting hopefully can help sort of clue you in. Since it's slanting towards the subject, what it's doing is it's telling you something about the subject, right? You are beautiful. So beautiful is sort of pointing back to what quality you have. That's the subject. So maybe that slanting line you can imagine as slanting toward the subject. As opposed to, if we go back here, when I gave the butter to John, or I gave John the butter, the line is slanting away from the subject, right? Because the action is moving away from the subject. So perhaps just iconically, thinking in terms of what you see, that may help you. Anybody have any questions about this?
Dr. Marshall?
Yeah.
Gonzalo and Jupiter on like that example, is that because these are to be verbs? So if Frodo, because I'm getting a little confused diagramming Greek, but if Frodo lives in the Shire, would that live in the Shire be modifying, would in the Shire be modifying live, like underneath that, or would it stay up top?
Yes. If it were Frodo lives in the Shire, then the prepositional phrase would go below. So you would have something like that. Frodo lives, and this is telling you where he lives, but not where he be. I could use any other action verb too, right? Frodo eats in the Shire. Frodo sleeps in the Shire. None of these are copular or linking verbs.
Dr. Marshall, not having done a lot of sentence diagramming before, what's the purpose of slanting the line?
Well, the slanting of the line signals function, right? So if I had, let's say I just had this, and I told you you could put a direct object here, or you could put a subject complement there, then I've got 2 exceptionally different types of sentences using the same structural diagram, don't I?
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So by slanting a line versus leaving it perpendicular like this, that helps with anticipating what role or function that noun has.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Marshall,
Sure. Yeah.
to revisit Frodo in the Shire, I would have been inclined to the popular sentence. I would have been inclined to drop that down as well. How would you diagram that? You just put the whole prepositional phrase as if it were one word.
What I would do here, and we're going to see this in the next thing, but what I would do is I would put the prepositional phrase on stilts or a standard, and the preposition goes on one side and the object of the preposition goes on the other. So they don't hang down. It's up top and attached to the part of the baseline where an obligatory constituent is, right? And the reason for doing it this way is that the prepositional phrase itself is a complicated, it's a complex grammatical structure. If I did something like this, let me oops, wrong direction here. No, that's the right direction. Sorry, I forgot what I was doing here. So normally prepositions go on the right side of an object line, right? And then the object of the preposition would go here. So forget all this for a minute, right? And normally the preposition and its object, it normally is a modifier hanging down. And so it's normally attached below like this. But what we're doing is we're not using it as a modifier, right? Since it's part of a subject verb subject complement structure, it's obligatory. So how do I signal that? Well, one thing that I could do is I could try to fit it on this sort of a baseline like this, like all of it. What does that end up doing then? It ends up muddying the basic sentence type, doesn't it? Because the baseline, if you look at the baseline, you should always see your basic sentence type. Well, what sort of a sentence type is this? This obscures the basic sentence type, right? But if, on the other hand, I take this part and raise it up, then what have I done? I've left the subject complement in the single subject complement slot, but I've been able to put the prepositional phrase into it, right? I'm going to drop it down onto it. That makes sense?
It does. So it's to help prevent confusion as to whether the baseline structure has an object or not.
Exactly. And this will become really especially needful if I have a sentence like this. I know that you are nice. Okay. So what do I have here? Well, I is the subject, right? Know is the verb. And then this whole thing is the direct object, isn't it? So how am I going to do that? Well, you could do something like this. You are nice, right? Well, what have I just done? I've created a monstrosity of a baseline with a sentence type that doesn't exist, where there's two subjects, two verbs, and one subject complement, right? So what's the way to go? It's to take this whole complicated thing, because the direct object is a whole clause, not just a noun, right? And I'm going to shove it up onto its own baseline and put a standard there. So it's going to look something like that. Or to maybe rewrite it, subject, verb, and then the direct object is a whole clause that has its own internal structure, right? Subject, verb, subject, complement. I know something. I know what? I know the clause content there. Good?
That's great. Yeah, Dr. Marshall,
Mhm.
question on the way you diagram that. If it's, that clause would go under, but you went above. Is there a reason for that, or it just doesn't matter which way?
I will suggest that you, where possible, put them up instead of down. You will see some diagrammers, for the sake of space, right? Their direct object clause might hang down. Okay, and that's possible given the constraints of space, but I prefer that they go up for this reason, as I've mentioned. Modifiers which are not obligatory, I want to see those below the baseline. They're what hang off of the baseline, the non-obligatory adjunct sort of information, and the obligatory things are on top of the baseline. And therefore, I like to see a clause that's functioning as a direct object. If the clause is functioning as a direct object, it's a complement, right? It's required. I know blank, right? The verb know is transitive. It needs an object. And I could put a noun here, but I could put a whole clause here, right? I know that you are nice. So I'm going to want to usually see that on top of the baseline, extending upward.
And Dr. Marshall, with that sentence, like you have the DO there next to that upward bracket.
Yeah.
What would it look like with that actual sentence? Would you have anything there, or would you just have the?
No, I'm just putting DO there just because we're all new at this, right? And I'm putting the theoretical things that go there, but it would be something like this if I were actually. Let me erase some of this stuff here. It would be something like this. Okay, so it would be I know, right? I would put the word that, and then I'd build my standard or still up from there. You are nice. So that's what that would look like.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Some people like to put the word that there, like in sort of like on top of that ascending line. I've just found it easier just to stick it here. In terms of if you're diagramming using computer programs, it's a little less cumbersome to have to dangle something there on the middle of a line. Okay, great. So back to the lecture here. In section E, we have SVDOOC. And again, that's the end of the sentence pattern. What's in parentheses is just telling you what sort of word can fill the OC slot. What does this refer to? Subject, verb, direct object. OC is an object complement. An object complement. And I'm going to have to use some examples maybe to explain what I mean by this, because you've probably never thought about it and thought about the grammar of it to even think that there was a label for this, okay? But what you have are certain types of verbs that take a direct object, and then they take an object complement, sometimes in the form of an adjective, sometimes in the form of a noun, where the object complement word is implicitly now describing or predicating something about the direct object. So let me give you some examples of verbs that do this. The verb to appoint can be used in this type of a structure. I appointed David the king. That is, I appointed David to a role, and that role is the king. And as a result of the appointing, now David is the king. Okay, so there's an implied predication, there's an implied copular relationship between the direct object and the object complement. David is the king as a result of my appointing. Now, the types of verbs that do this are verbs then that have the power by the verb being carried out to make things real, but it doesn't always effectuate what it intends. Let me give you a couple of examples, and then I'll give you one where it doesn't happen. I made my dog pretty. Okay, so the verb is made, the dog is the object, and pretty is what I made my dog to be, right? So I made my dog pretty. And then I dubbed thee knight. This is something that we used to do when I was a kid, where we would play knights and King Arthur and all of that stuff. And I don't know, I was never got to be the king to do the dubbing. I was always the one that had to get on my knee in front of somebody. But I dubbed thee knight. So dub is the verb, thee is the object, direct object, and what I dubbed thee to be is the object complement. I dubbed thee knight. All right. Now, I could say something like this. Mark called Elymas a liar. Okay, so what role does Mark have?
Subject.
He's the subject. Called
Verb.
Elymas.
Right.
Safe drivers say for not answering their phone while driving. They feel like
And a liar.
It's
Yes, this is the object complement. There's an implied predication as a result of the calling. It's assumed that Elymas is a liar, right? Now, what if, on the other hand, I had not Elymas, but Jesus? And we're talking about the Son of God. It's still a subject, verb, direct object, object complement sentence, isn't it? But is Jesus really a liar?
No.
No. So is there an implied predication about Jesus being a liar? Yes, but just because Mark calls him one doesn't necessarily make it so, right? So I say that to say, in most cases, the verb effectuates some change of role or characteristic for the direct object, and whatever that new role or characteristic is the object complement. But it's not always the case, at least in terms of reality, right? So I made my dog pretty, at least I think so, right? Presumably the dog's pretty now, but someone could look at the dog and say, no, that dog is ugly, right? I dubbed thee knight. I could say that, and presumably that effectuates the fact that you are now a knight. But if I don't have the authority to dub anyone knight, then I can say it all I want. Doesn't make it so, right? You get what I'm saying?
Dr. Marshall, it seems like that qualification is based on the subject.
Yeah, it's based on the social, really the social or metaphysical reality of the subject's nature. Mm-hmm.
They have the authority to appoint David the king, or they just say that they do.
Right.
And if it was third person, then it would be, because all of your examples are first person. So if it's third person, then it would just be as the narrator interpreting that.
Well, I think I would put it this way. No matter whether the subject of the verb really has the authority or power to do it or not, the sentence is still asserting it, but the sentence may not be true, right?
Right.
So in that regard, what's being asserted is that there's an implied relationship, an implied real relationship between the direct object and the object complement. It's just that in this sentence with Mark, Mark's just being a clown and doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk about problems of ambiguity, okay? One of the things that we're going to face in reading Hebrew, and it's going to be a little bit complicated and confusing and disorienting, is when we come to what are called appositional phrases.
Hey, Dr. Marshall, this is Dan.
What is apposition? Apposition happens when you have two nouns that are side by side, so they're juxtaposed one right next to the other, and the first noun is filling the function slot in the sentence, and then the second noun is an adjunct. It's being added and is going to refer to the first noun, the one that it's right next to. It's going to refer to the same thing, whatever that first noun refers to, the second noun refers to. So they refer to the same entity. They have the same referent. And what we say is that the second noun is in apposition to the first noun. We call that second noun an appositive. An appositive. So I'll jot that word down here. So appositive. Okay. So that's the name for the second noun in apposition to the first. Here's an example from the handout. Charlie, my brother, kicked the can. Okay. What is the verb? The verb is kicked. Can is direct object. What is the subject of this sentence? Is the subject Charlie or is the subject my brother?
Charlie.
The subject is Charlie. Charlie kicked the can. Okay. Charlie kicked the can. So what role does my brother have in this sentence? Well, the role my brother doesn't have an actual grammatical role in the sentence. This is a subject, verb, direct object sentence where all my obligatory constituents are seen here. Charlie kicked the can. Okay. And my brother, this is an adjunct, right? In the form of apposition. He is an appositive to Charlie. Does Charlie refer to my oldest brother? Yes. Does the expression my brother refer to that same brother? Yes. So we have apposition when the first noun and the second noun both refer to the same entity. Okay, these are not two different people. These are the same people. And one is recharacterizing or describing the other. Okay, take a look at this example. Charlie and my brother kicked the can. Here, Charlie refers to one guy, right? He's person number one. And my brother is person number two. There, they don't refer to the same person. And also, another big difference is that the coordinating conjunction and joins both of those nouns. And together, they both form the subject slot. Charlie and my brother equals the subject. Kicked is the verb. And the direct object is can. Okay, so Charlie and my brother here are not the same person, and they are not juxtaposed, that is slapped side by side together without the conjunction and. So this is not an example of apposition. One helpful hint here, if you see two nouns side by side that might be an apposition, one you can do a little test by inserting the expression namely or who is between those two noun phrases and see if that makes sense. And if it does, then you probably have apposition. So our example here was Charlie, my brother, kicked the can, right? Maybe I can rephrase it as Charlie, namely my brother, kicked the can. And here it's fairly clear that Charlie equals my brother here, right? Charlie, namely my brother, kicked the can, and Charlie, who is my brother, kicked the can. Same thing. All right, so rephrasing this way can be a helpful tool in capturing the sense of the sentence when there's apposition. And if you do that, but it doesn't make sense, then you don't have apposition and you have to find some other role for that second noun. Okay. So that's an issue. Now, here's where ambiguity comes in. So now we know that there's such a thing as appositional structures where you have a noun next to another noun and the second noun is in a positive and rephrasing who or what that first noun is. And then at other times we have object complements that are next to a direct object. And the question then becomes if those two sorts of nouns are side by side, might I confuse those with an appositional phrase? And the answer is yes, you could. Yes, you could. All right, so take a look here at what we've got. And these differences where there's ambiguity are going to convey different conceptual situations. So a sentence like Yahweh appointed David the king. Yahweh appointed David the king. This is a grammatically ambiguous sentence. Now, there's nothing ambiguous about the meaning of the words, right? Yahweh is the name of the God of Israel. Appointed means setting aside for a role. David is the shepherd boy, the son of Jesse, right? And the king is a social role within Israel. There's nothing ambiguous about the meaning of the words at all. So where does the ambiguity lie? The ambiguity lies in the grammar, okay? That's the issue here. That's the issue. So what are the two possible ways of analyzing this? Well, this could be a situation where David is already the king when the sentence is uttered. If David's already the king, and then somebody says, as if this were now new information, Yahweh appointed David the king, then what the speaker would seem to be indicating here is that Yahweh has now appointed David to some other office beside king because he's already the king at this point. And the king then is in apposition to the direct object, David. And what it's doing is it's specifying just some additional information about David who has received some appointment. So it could be rephrased as Yahweh appointed David, who was the king, or Yahweh appointed David, namely the king. And so what type of a sentence is this on this first construal? It's a subject verb direct object type of sentence. So Yahweh appointed David and the king is in apposition. Okay, so the basic sentence type is this SVDO. How would I diagram that? Yahweh appointed David goes in this order, right? With these sorts of lines. And then appositives are separated from the noun to which they're anchored by an equal sign. Because in apposition, the anchor noun and the appositive noun always refer to the same entity. Now, if I had, just to clarify, you know how we had Charlie, my brother, kick the can, right? What would that look like? Well, that would look something like this. We said Charlie was the real subject, right? Kicked is the verb, and the can is the direct object. Where would my appositive go? Well, it's kind of hard to stick it on the left side of Charlie since I've got a verb right here in the way, don't I? So where would I want to put the appositive? It'll go on the right. Oops, sorry, doing Greek. So Charlie, my brother. There, the appositive is on the other side. Okay, so it really depends on whether you're dealing with a subject or an object, which direction that equal sign can go.
Is there a scenario where you would have like an indirect object in opposition that would be sandwiched, and you'd have to kind of figure that out?
Yes, that's theoretically possible too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure I've ever had to diagram that. So if we come to one, I'll help you figure it out. Now, scenario number 2, David is not the king yet. David's not the king, okay? And so we could interpret the speaker as intending here that Yahweh has appointed David to now be the office bearer of the king, all right? So David is the direct object again, but the king is now an object complement, not an appositional structure, indicating what the direct object has become as a result of Yahweh's appointing. And you could rephrase this as Yahweh appointed David to be the king, right? But what this ends up creating is a 4-part sentence pattern, subject, verb, direct object, but the additional obligatory object complement. So Yahweh appointed David the king would be would look like this. Okay, so we're going to put that object complement literally on the baseline with that slanting line. All right, so everybody sees the difference. So both of these sentences have the same words in the exact same order, but they actually mean different things. And the difference is a grammatical difference. And you can get at that grammatical difference by diagram. All right. The line diagram shows you the hidden, unseen structure of each sentence as construed different ways.
Dr. Marshall?
Yeah.
Zach and Lynchburg. So in a situation like this, obviously we're taking this passage or even just this sentence out of context, but that would be a contextual decision, correct?
Yeah, so in context, the ambiguity is often cleared up. Absolutely. In isolation, there's potential for ambiguity. Okay, great. Now, last example, this is a hot dog of an example, okay? There could be ambiguity between indirect objects, appositional phrases, and object complements. So in English, as you're listening to people talk, you usually don't have this problem. The problem comes when you're dealing with a language that you don't speak natively, and you're sort of atomistically looking at each part and trying to figure out how do these foreign words fit together. It's in this situation where potential ambiguities happen. Because when you're talking fast and in the flow of a conversation, there's a lot more comprehension going on just in the nature of the case. You're speaking each other's language, and you have a lot of background knowledge as well that informs what are possible and not possible construals. But when you're dealing with an ancient text, so you're not situated in the background knowledge yet, and you're working with a language you don't know very well, then these become real problem areas for us. Okay, and I just want to make you aware of those potential ambiguities. So here I've given us the sentence, I made David a hot dog. I made David a hot dog. And there's actually 3 different ways that you can understand this, okay? Number 1, perhaps David is a proverbial hot dog, which is a slang term for someone who shows off and performs risky stunts. So back when I was in high school, guys who were skateboarders who did all sorts of sick tricks, they were referred to as hot dogs. Or if they skied and they could do flips and things like that, might refer to someone as a hot dog. So the speaker might here intend to convey that the subject I created David, whom everyone already knows to be a hot dog. And in this sort of a scenario, the noun phrase, a hot dog, is in apposition to the direct object David, specifying some additional information about the David whom I have created or made. All right, so I could rephrase this as I made David, who is a hot dog. All right, and the basic sentence type is SVDO. So that's reflected in my diagram, subject, verb, direct object. And then a hot dog is in apposition. And so it's telling me something additional about who or what David is. All right. Now, who could say this? Well, God could say it, right? Number 2, perhaps hot dog refers to a real piece of food and not a proverbial, guy who does tricks. If this is the case, then traditional grammar would consider David to be an indirect object. And it indicates for whom I, the subject, have made this literal hot dog. Okay. And if that's the case, then this is a subject, verb, indirect object, direct object type of sentence. I made David, indirect object, hot dog. That's what I made, and it's a literal hot dog now. And then the last is a direct object complement type of sentence where David's not a proverbial hot dog yet, but the speaker intends to convey that I have somehow turned David into a proverbial hot dog. So maybe I kept telling him, hey, go do this trick, try this out. And after he keeps doing all these stupid things, he ends up becoming the proverbial hot dog out on the ski course or in the skateboard park. So on this construal, David's direct object and a hot dog is what he is made to be, i.e. the object complement. So I made David to be a hot dog is the way you could paraphrase it. So subject, verb, direct object, and object complement. All 3 of these sentence meanings share the same words in the exact same order. So what distinguishes them? Something invisible that you don't see on the surface. And that is the syntactic or the grammatical structure. And that grammatical structure is gotten at least visibly through these different diagrams, right? So I have 3 different diagrams that represent the 3 different ways that you could construe the grammar of the sentence. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, good. So how you understand the assertion depends on how you understand the constituents to function. And determining the sentence type or pattern or typology, and then drawing a sentence diagram can be a very helpful tool here. It can force you to make syntactic and interpretive choices. And the types and the diagrams differ from one scenario to the other based on which ambiguous interpretation you take. Okay, good. Ambiguities in language are delightful. Sometimes they're troublesome, but they're delightful because they can make us laugh. Okay, so one of my favorite ones is that there was a headline once where some company that made eye drops had a bad batch went out that was recalled. So one of the things in the headlines was I drops off shelf. Okay. So if you read that in the newspaper headline, it might be clear if you've got the background information, but if you don't, this is ambiguous, right? Either I is the subject and drops is the verb, and somebody's I drops off of a shelf, or I drops goes together and there is an implied verb of being that is unstated. I drops are off shelf, which was the intended way of reading it. But of course, it makes us laugh and giggle when you read it the wrong way. And that's where syntactic ambiguities can be fun. So we want to grab your handout here, sentence structure, larger constituents. Sentence structure, larger constituents. John, you have a copy of these?
I do, yes, sir.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's look at this. What we did in the last handout was we looked at main sentence patterns, the basic ones, what the things were that normally filled the various function slots of subject, verb, indirect object, direct object, object complements, right? So subjects are usually nouns. Object complements and subject complements are usually nouns or adjectives. Direct objects and indirect objects are usually nouns. Now, I'm aware that I may be using some terms here that for some of you, the notion of a noun versus an adjective may still be a little bit fuzzy. Okay. But so to maybe help you, if we do something called a little bit of frame analysis, where we create sentences where we leave a frame open, and here it's the subject, then the question is what sorts of words can fill that frame? Blank died. Give me some examples.
Worms died.
Worms? Worms died. Good. Give me more. Or are worms the only thing that die in your world? Okay, good. Jesus died. What?
Batteries.
I'm sorry. Didn't quite catch that.
Happiness.
Oh, happiness. Yes. Happiness. Okay, good. These are great examples, okay? Worms, Jesus, and happiness. We are a pathetic lot. We are. Okay. Now, well, can I put the word eat died?
No.
No. What about happy? The adjective. Happy died. Not unless it refers to a person, right? Like there are people who are nicknamed Happy. What about sad died?
No.
How about over? Over died.
No.
No. Lightly.
No.
No. Okay. So what are we looking at here? So eat is a verb, right? Happy is an adjective, as is sad. Over is a preposition. Lightly is an adverb. Okay, but worms, Jesus, and happiness, these are all nouns. Okay, in other words, thinking in terms of just English grammar, only nouns can fill this slot as a general rule. Okay, or if not nouns, things that behave like nouns, noun-like things. Because what we've learned in Hebrew and if you're taking Greek, sometimes adjectives can function like nouns, right?
Yes.
And when adjectives function like nouns, then they can fill the frames that nouns fill. The righteous.
Substantive.
Right? That's a substantival or a nominalized use of the adjective. So the righteous died. Righteous is technically an adjective, but this is functioning as a noun. Okay. So what am I trying to help you do? I'm trying to help you think through, even if you may not be able to give a good grammatical definition of a noun. A noun is anything that can fill the slot in the sentence blank died. Okay. Now, if I put a frame like this, a blank boy, what kind of words can fill that slot?
Adjective.
Attributed adjectives.
Yeah, adjectives, right? Good. So I can put adjectives there. For subjects, I can put nouns. Well, so like what sorts of words would be appropriate here? Adjectives.
Worry.
Yeah, a wormy boy. Absolutely. Yes. A Jesus-y boy. A happy boy, right? A sad boy. What's another? A dirty boy. Yes. For some reason, when I had a daughter, all boys became dirty. Dirty old boys. Keep those boys away. Okay, good. So those are all adjectives. But what about what about verbs? An eat boy. That's not grammatical, right? What about an over boy? No. A lightly boy?
No.
No. A happiness boy?
No.
Or a worms boy? Right? None of those other things work because they're the wrong part of speech. They belong to the other parts of speech besides the ones that can fill the frame of a blank boy, where the blank is a kind of boy, right? And the adjective then qualifies it in some way. So I'm saying all of that to say that over here, we're using expressions, we're using terms that I'm assuming you know. But if you're not sure whether a word is a noun or an adjective, that's one test that you can use. Little frame tests like that. Okay. Okay. Now, sometimes we have sentences that aren't basic. In fact, if all of our sentences were just very simple, basic sentences, our language would be very boring and our conversation would be very boring. But we can fill those function slots with things that are bigger than we expect, right? And sometimes we can fill those frames with things that are from a different category than what we expect. And so I mentioned here, the subject slot normally is filled by a noun, but sometimes an adjective can fill that function slot. When it does, we say that the adjective could be functioning nominally. A nominal is anything that is not a noun but functions like a noun. And sometimes the word substantively is used for that, because a synonym for noun is substantive. Okay, so a substantive is a noun. So we're basically creating adjectives and adverbs out of noun, nominal, nominally, or substantive, substantival, substantively. Okay. All right, so example, the righteous are bold. Subject, verb, subject, complement type of sentence. We've got a nice structure right there. Okay, but look at our example. The subject slot could be something besides a substantival adjective functioning as a noun. I could have a prepositional phrase functioning as a noun, so to speak, right? The prepositional phrase could be the subject. Above the sea is the best place for me. And I've got this line diagrammed here. So here is our subject, verb, subject, complement structure, right? The basic structure is the same, but instead of a single item in the subject slot, what have I done? I've put a prepositional phrase here. And because the prepositional phrase has its own internal structure, I can't stick it all on the line here, right? I have to push it up on the standard to give it a line of its own that can then allow its constituents to be clearly seen. And then the subject could even be a whole clause. That you love me is mystifying, right? That you love me is the subject. The verb is the copular verb is, and mystifying is the subject complement. So we have a subject, verb, subject, complement structure. So we use that diagramming type, but notice that I've got an entire clause now that's functioning as the subject. And so I have to push it up on the standard or the stilts, if you want to call it stilts, and give it its own structure, because that clause has its own subject, verb, direct object, right? You love me is a different type of sentence than something is mystifying, right?
Dr. Marshall?
Yeah.
This is Nate in Jacksonville. Just a quick question, going back to the C above example.
Yeah.
I would have, I don't know, I normally would think to put the for me part under the verb. Why would you ever do that? Why would you choose to do it under the object complement versus under the verb?
Yeah, so why have I pushed the prepositional phrase up above rather than putting it below where for me goes?
No, not that one. Just for me specifically, I would have thought, if I was doing it myself, I would have thought to put it under is for me, rather than under place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So I'm glad you clarified that. Let me get rid of all the markings here. So just so that everybody else is clear, like I wasn't just a second ago, the question is why for me here under place and not under is, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. I've made a judgment here that that the for me is more closely related to the noun place than it is to the predication is. All right. So let me try to think of another example where maybe it's a little bit clearer. If I said something like I could say something like Herod was crazy with jealousy. All right. So how would I diagram that? Doing our Hebrew order. Herod's the subject. Was. What kind of line am I going to do here? Straight or slanting?
Planted
Slanted to the right or to the left?
To the right.
Slanting to the right, because this is a subject verb subject complement, right? Everybody agree? Yes? Okay. So Herod was crazy. And then where do I put this? This is a prepositional phrase with jealousy, isn't it?
Yes.
So normally, like you want to put because most prepositional phrases are adverbial. Usually they do go under the verb. So whoever asked the question, I forget, the instinct was right. You know, you might want to put it there. But I'm going to put it here. Is that where you want to put it, or do you want to put it under was?
I think I always just defaulted to it under the verb, and so I was just trying to think through. You're saying based off of it being closely aligned, you're going to put it under the.
Right. Yeah. In other words, it's really more closely connected with the crazy idea, crazy with jealousy, than with just the predicating act.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now it is a judgment call sometimes. Sometimes it is a little bit difficult to know with a copular verb, with an action verb, like a real transitive or intransitive verb. Sometimes it's a lot clearer and a lot easier. So let's say I dropped the word best and I said above the sea is the place for me. Does that make it a little clearer that for me is more closely connected with place than anything else?
It helps.
Yeah. Okay. And we've just made that place for me superlative by adding best. Okay, great. So let's go on now to types of clauses. And here I don't mean sentence pattern when I say types of clauses, but something else. Okay. We have some clauses. Clauses are sentences with at least a subject and a verb. Okay. Some clauses can stand alone and other clauses can't. They're integral parts of a larger clause. And I want to go through some of the types of clauses in terms of how they can stand on their own or be embedded in other clauses. Okay, so again, we need some basic terms here. Probably the term that you are most familiar with is independent clause, but other language folk will also label these as matrix clauses or main clauses. Okay, every time I see the word matrix, I think of Keanu Reeves, and then I want to don my black trench coat, start shooting things. Independent clauses or matrix clauses or main clauses can stand alone and contain a predicate, some verbal assertion, and at least an implied, if not an explicit subject, and they express a proposition. So our examples here, Martha burned the soup, Martha made Jesus a meal, you are beautiful. All of these sentences are clauses that can stand alone. And so they're independent. They form a complete grammatical thought by themselves. Now, in contrast to this, we have what are called dependent clauses. Dependent clauses are often described as embedded clauses or subordinate clauses. And they are embedded as constituents in a larger clause. And they play a role in that larger clause, either as noun, adjective, or adverb. Okay. And we're going to walk through how they do each of these things in just a moment. But what they can't do is they can't stand alone like an independent clause can. So in our three examples here, we have we love because he first loved us. Okay, we love because he first loved us. This expression, because he first loved us, is giving the reason why we love. Okay, so what is it doing? It's qualifying the verb love, isn't it? And so we could say that that embedded clause, because he first loved us, is adverbial. It modifies the verb love, tells you why the loving happened. It's not modifying we, it's modifying the act of loving. Okay. In the next sentence, we have Paul, who was an apostle, wrote Galatians. Who was an apostle is also an embedded clause or a subordinate clause. What is it modifying or describing?
Paul.
Yeah, it's telling you something about Paul, right? Paul is the subject of the main verb. Wrote is the verb, and Galatians is the direct object. So the main clause is subject, verb, direct object, but the embedded clause has its own structures, right? Subject, verb, subject, complement, telling you what Paul was. Okay, and that embedded clause has a modifying function, and it's modifying a noun, Paul. Whereas in the first embedded clause, it was modifying the verb. So the first embedded clause is adverbial. Okay. The second embedded clause is what we call a relative clause. And you guys know about relative clauses. And I told you a long time ago, relative clauses are adjectival because they're describing a noun. Paul, who was an apostle, Paul's a noun, right? That relative clause is modifying the noun. The man who came to dinner is modifying the noun man in the man who came to dinner. I killed the mayor who was a racketeer. The mayor is the noun, and who was a racketeer is a modifying relative clause. It modifies the noun. So relative clauses are doing what adjectives do. They modify noun. Okay. And then the last thing I have is I know that Ivan loves me. That Ivan loves me is the dependent or embedded clause. I know, subject verb. What's the direct object? The direct object is the whole that clause, isn't it? And so the role of this embedded clause is that it's functioning like a noun. Nouns are usually direct objects, but here the whole embedded clause is the direct object. And so we would say that the clause is nominal in its function because this embedded clause is functioning like a noun. It's the direct object of I know. Now, taking each of these embedded clauses on their own, because he first loved us, who was an apostle, and that Ivan loves me. None of these can stand on their own grammatically. Okay? If I just walk up to you and said, hey, Johnny, because he first loved us, have I given you a dependent or an independent clause there? I've given you a dependent one, but without a clause, a larger clause to embed it. And when that happens, it's not grammatical. It sounds odd. It sounds funny, right? It doesn't sound right. If I walk up to you and I say, hey, Johnny, that Ivan loves me. You want to know, how does that relate to a larger sentence structure, don't you? So, dependent clauses need the rest of an independent or the rest of a matrix clause to make sense grammatically. All right. Now, I do have a comment here. Notice that the first three sample sentences that I've given under independent clauses, these sentences are all independent clauses. But be aware that the 3 sample sentences under dependent clauses, when taken as whole sentences, I mean, the 3 sample sentences under dependent clauses, when taken as whole sentences, they are also independent clauses that can stand alone. Let me go back up here. So what I'm saying is these are independent clauses, right? These are also independent clauses. That is to say, the whole sentence, we love because he first loved us, that whole thing is an independent clause. It can stand on its own, right? If I say Paul, who was an apostle, wrote Galatians, that whole sentence can stand independently. The only thing that's dependent in any of this is what I'm highlighting in green, right? Those are the only clauses that are dependent. But the entirety of each of the 3 clauses under this second little discussion, the entirety of each clause as a whole is an independent clause because each of those clauses can hang by itself. All right. So only it's in those last 3 sentences, it's only a portion of the independent clause that taken by itself cannot stand alone. And that leads us to a conclusion here. Okay, and this is very important. Number 1, some independent clauses have no dependent clauses. That's true up here, right? These are independent clauses, but without dependent clauses. And then, conclusion number 2, some independent clauses do have dependent clauses. And that's what these are here, right? These are independent clauses with dependent clauses shoved in. And so with that in mind, we have a few more definitions, terms that we want to make sure.
Dr. Marshall?
Yes.
Having trouble really understanding the nominal clause.
Yeah. A nominal clause is a dependent or embedded clause that functions like a noun. So it's going to go wherever a noun can go. So what can nouns do? Nouns can function how? Nouns can be subjects of sentences, right? Nouns can be direct objects of sentences. What else can a noun do?
Object of a preposition.
Yes, a noun can be the object of a preposition too. Okay? Those are the 3 main functions. So what I'm saying is usually nouns, simple little basic nouns, fill the slot of subject, direct object, object of the preposition. But when a clause is filling one of those slots, it's a nominal clause. That clause is functioning like a noun.
Hey, Dr. Marshall, I'm looking at the second example of like underneath the dependent clauses, and I'm having the term relative clause is like hard for me, not a very good distinction because all dependent clauses are relative to an extent.
Well, okay, yeah, like relative meaning relative to the rest of the sentence, like related to, I guess. But no, we don't use the word relative clause to describe all dependent clauses.
So the best
Only
way
a subsection.
Okay, so the best way to remember that one really would be just to realize that it's acting as an adjective.
Yes, relative clauses are acting as adjectives.
Okay,
Exactly.
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So let's go back here. What I want to do is just walk through how we label sentences in relation to the question of embedding, okay, or the dependent clauses. The term simple sentence is used for an independent clause with how many dependent clauses? All right, that's what makes it simple. There are no embedded or dependent clauses. So Jack loves Mary is a very simple sentence. Jack loves Mary. I have one baseline in my line diagram and the constituents that make it up. Jack loves Mary for a good old subject, verb, direct object type of sentence. Okay. But a complex sentence is an independent clause that contains at least one dependent clause. So look at my example. Jack loves Mary because she rides motorcycles. Now the simple sentence and the complex sentence start off exactly the same way, right? And they're both diagrammed the same way. Jack loves Mary, subject, verb, followed by a direct object slot with a straight line that stops on the baseline. But what have I added here? I've got this dependent clause that's been appended. And that dependent clause gives me the reason that Jack loves Mary. And that comes in the form of because she rides motorcycles. Now, where did I hang the dependent clause off of the main clause?
Under the verb.
Yes, it hangs off the verb. Why? Because it's explaining the reason for the love. That is, it is adverbial. Now, not every complex sentence has an adverbial dependent clause, right? Sometimes the dependent clauses can be adjectival, in which case they're relative clauses. Or sometimes the dependent clause could be nominal, in which case it's going to be functioning like a subject or an object. All right. But here it happens to be adverbial. That's why it's hanging off of the constituent spot where the verb is. And it's giving the reason for the love. Jack loves Mary because she rides motorcycles. Make sense so far?
Yes.
Okay, great. I feel like Jesus asking his disciples, do you understand? Yes, Lord. And they don't.
Hey, Dr. Marshall, real quick, how would you label that dependent clause?
How would I label what now?
Dependent clause. Aside from just saying this is a dependent adverbial dependent clause, how would you then take it one step further and then label those markers?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's good. So basically, when you have adverbial dependent clauses, just so you know, the recommendation is to use this kind of a shelf-like thing, or it looks like a little terrace, right? So it hangs down, comes to the left. You can set your conjunction that joins the dependent clause to the main clause, and then you drop down one more step in order to attach a baseline for the dependent clause. Okay, so in terms of structure, we can say it's dependent, right? So that's the broadest designation, dependent. But dependent clauses are of a variety. So the next way to describe it is to say adverbial, okay? And that's still a grammatical or a syntactic designation. But now there's one more thing we can say about it, and that gets to the semantic question. What is the semantic relationship of she rides motorcycles to Jack loves Mary? The semantic relationship would be something like causal or explanatory, right? That is to say, she rides motorcycles is the explanation or the reason for Jack loves Mary. Does it have to be causal? Not like, do adverbial dependent clauses have to be causal? No. Okay. Let's change this to while. Jack loves Mary while she rides motorcycles, but not when she doesn't. Okay, so is this still a dependent clause while she rides motorcycles? Yeah, it's still dependent, right? Is it still adverbial?
Yeah, it's still adverbial.
Yes, but is it causal?
No, because there's like
No.
a time, there's a time in there.
It's a time-related adverbial notion. So we would change the semantics from causal to temporal.
Sure.
Okay, that's the semantics. So the structure is still the same, but the semantic classification of the structure is now different, right? And so this is what I'm getting at when if you remember when we were walking through the syllabus, I said, what you're going to do is you're going to analyze the syntax, you're going to analyze the syntactic structures of the clauses you see, and then you're going to make semantic classification choices based on the syntax you're looking at. Because sometimes there's a variety of semantic possibilities.
So you would then label, if you were to like get down to the actual word usage, while or because is your conjunction, and then you would have she as the subject, ride as a verb, motorcycle as a direct object again. Okay.
Right. So it turns out that the dependent clause and the main clause, both of them happen to have the same structure, right?
Right.
But this clause is simply an embedded part of the other clause.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. Now, compound sentences, these are sentences that contain two independent clauses, and those independent clauses are joined by a coordinating conjunction. So coordinating conjunctions like and, but, yet, however, rather, but not joined by a subordinating conjunction. Those would be things like because, when, while, or after, okay? Subordinating conjunctions create subordinate or dependent clauses. But these, when we talk about compound sentences, we're not talking about adding a subordinating clause to a main clause. We're actually giving two independent clauses and using a coordinating conjunction to join them. So our example here is Jack loves Mary and she rides motorcycles. These are just two separate clauses that can each stand alone, right? Jack loves Mary, she loves motorcycles. Perfectly fine for each of them to stand by themselves, right? Now, if I said because she rides motorcycles, the use of the subordinating conjunction forces me to construe it as having to go with some larger clause that it's embedded in. But here, she rides motorcycles doesn't have a subordinating conjunction, and therefore it is an independent clause. And so two independent clauses can be joined together, and when they are, we call this a compound sentence. Now, I probably should have given you one more designation. And what it does is it combines these two together. That is, there is such a thing as a compound complex sentence. So what do you think a compound complex sentence is?
A sentence with two independent clauses that are joined by a coordinating conjunction, where one of the two independent clauses has a dependent clause attached to it.
Right. So the two independent clauses joined together as a compound sentence, but one has a dependent or an embedded clause. All right. So I could make this compound sentence a compound complex sentence by adding a dependent clause to one of them. Jack loves Mary, and let's say, who is his wife. There I've added a relative clause, right? And she rides motorcycles. So two independent clauses, but Mary is now being modified by a dependent relative clause. So that's a compound complex sentence. Okay. So based on my use of the word sentence here and these terms, what can you say about the relationship between sentences and clauses?
A clause can be a sentence, but a sentence isn't always just a clause.
Right. Yeah. And to maybe put it another way, sentences can consist of multiple clauses, right? And a sentence could be one clause as well. So the word sentence is a broader designation.
Dr. Marshall, when it comes to these compound sentences, a lot of times there won't be a coordinating conjunction though, correct? Sometimes a semicolon will just be inserted.
Yeah, that's true. So in our language, we can join with a coordinating conjunction, or just a semicolon. Could do. Other languages don't have those punctuation conventions, right? And so it could just be no conjunction, two sentences just slapped up next to each other, or a connection with Bob, for example.
Are those decisions just made when it comes to translating Hebrew into English, like our English Bible? Are those decisions just made by the translator to separate those into separate sentences, or to make it a compound sentence? Is that just a decision that has to be made on their part?
Yes. Yeah. Like when you think about it, as we mentioned back in elementary Hebrew, when we talked about the disjunctive vav, I showed you how almost every sentence in Hebrew starts with a vav, right? You remember that? Almost every Hebrew clause begins with a vav. What do we do with that? Well, if you were diagramming the whole book of Jonah, most of your sentence diagrams would look like one long line with these, clauses, and it just looks like this endless string of one huge compound sentence. But of course, that's really not feasible, is it? So it does become a judgment where if for the most part, you break them up. But if you found two sentences joined by a vav, which seem to have a closer relationship to each other as independent clauses, but seem more closely related to each other than to the next sentence, then you could make a judgment and put them together as a compound sentence.
Because you see that a lot too in the Hebrew poetry as well. A lot of these compound sentences as well, because
because you have these sets of parallel lines, right? You look at Proverbs, usually you have two lines that have, they're two clauses. So you'll hang those together as a compound structure. And then the next two lines of poetry are saying something different. So yeah. All right. Goodness, time flies when we're having fun. Okay, let's take a look at these types of subordinate clauses then. And here we're just going to drill down a little bit more on what we've been talking about and give some examples. Relative clauses, these are a kind of subordinate or dependent or embedded clause, right? They're usually introduced by the words who, which, or that. So those are relative pronouns in English. And they function adjectivally. Meaning, what do adjectives modify? Adjectives modify nouns. So relative clauses, if they're adjectival, serve to modify nouns. So take a look at our example here. I know the terrible man, and I know the man who is terrible. So I've italicized the word that modifies man, and in the second sentence, the clause that modifies man. The basic idea is I know the man, right? That's the basic idea. I know the man. And I'm telling you what kind of man by use of either an adjective in the first example, just a simple adjective, or in the second example, I'm using an entire clause to modify the man. I know the man who is terrible. Now, since relative clauses have the function of modifying a noun, what we're going to do with the relative clause is the same thing we would do with an adjective when we're modifying one of those. Adjectives are going to go below the baseline under the thing they modify. So I don't know if I've talked about this before, but if you can just imagine with me, like I'm talking to a group of men. So this is probably just doomed to failure to begin with. But if you can just imagine that the baseline is a curtain rod. Okay? You walk into a room, you've got windows with window dressing. And the curtain rod is the main structure. And it's usually drilled into the wall, right? Curtain rods are long and straight, like the baseline. And then what hangs off of the curtain rod? The window dressing. Okay. So the curtain rod represents obligatory constituents, and these obligatory constituents make up the sentence pattern. What's the sentence pattern here? I know the man, subject, verb, direct object. These are the obligatory things, right? What is the window dressing? The window dressing, these are the modifiers. These are the adjuncts. These are the things that are not obligatory, but they dress up the essential components that are. So I know the man is by itself a perfectly good grammatical sentence. I know the terrible man is more interesting. I've dressed up the sentence with a modifier, right? But one which, if I omit it, doesn't make the sentence ungrammatical.
Dr. Marshall.
Yes.
This may never actually come up in biblical Hebrew, but we were talking about it earlier, like with the sentence example that you used, talking about eye drops. So like eye drops, those are drops used for eyes. So like eye is technically describing the type of drops. So if you were diagramming that, would that be contained all in itself as the subject, or would I go under as an adjective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, if you take eye drops as a single item, then you could leave them together, right, in the slot. But if I truly is just functioning as a modifier, like a brick house, an eye drop, like that sort of thing, then yeah, you'd stick it under the word drop. So you could have eye drops, ear drops, right? There's a variety, I guess, of sorts of drops that you could have. And so yeah, like if it were hyphenated, then at least mentally, as a language user, I'm taking it as one thing, right? But if there's space between the two words, then yeah, it's probably, I is probably more of a modifier there. Okay, now take a look here. I've got the same sentence structure, subject, verb, direct, object, but notice this clause is the window dressing. It's a relative clause, but where's it hanging? It's hanging off of the man, the direct object slot, because it modifies the man, doesn't it? Now, there's this line here, a straight line down, just like the adjective. It has a straight line down. But what's the difference between the two? I've got a clause that sits where the adjective would have sat. And so that clause has to be on its standard to be able to give it its own baseline, because there's a complex structure here. Okay. Now, there's one other thing about relative clauses that you'll notice here. What's that dotted line doing? It's connecting the relative pronoun to the noun that's being modified. Do you remember in Hebrew, we talked about the head of a relative clause, and then we talked about the resumptive pronoun inside the relative clause. And anytime we have a relative clause, the head of the relative clause is the thing the relative clause modifies. So what's the head of the relative clause in I know the man who is terrible? What's the head? Sometimes we also use the word antecedent. What's the head?
Is it man?
Yes, the man is the head. Okay. And when we have a relative clause, there's always some element inside the relative clause that resumes, that refers back to the head and is identical to the head. So which word in who is terrible is resumptive, is identical to and refers back to the head? Who? The word who in who is terrible is identical to the man, right? I can replace the resumptive word with the head word, and it would mean exactly what it says. The man is terrible. Isn't that what I'm asserting here? I know the man who is terrible. I've got a man who is terrible, and I'm saying that I know that man, right? So the head and the resumptive element are co-referential in relative clauses. We co-referential. We're going to talk a lot more about this because we're going to see a lot more of it as we read Jonah. But I used this term back when we introduced relative clauses a long time ago in elementary Hebrew. That is to say, the head, the word that is the head, and the word that is the resumptive word, usually a resumptive pronoun, those are co-referential. They refer to the same entity. Okay. Now, there is a dotted line that I'm going to use in my diagram to connect those two. Okay. And you may not understand yet why I do that, but it will become clear as we move on why that's an important thing to know. All right. So that's a relative clause. Let's talk about nominal clauses here. We have 12 minutes, so let's see how far we can get. I think we can get through this. Nominal clauses, these are subordinate clauses. Relative clauses are subordinate too, right? But these are nominal clauses that function how? They function as noun phrases, or as they function nominally. Nominally. They function like nouns. Okay? What does that mean? That means they fill a noun function in a sentence. Whatever a noun can do, a nominal clause can do. All right? So Nouns are usually direct objects. And a nominal clause could be a direct object as well. So our example here, I know Ivan. I know Ivan. I is the subject, know is the verb, Ivan is my direct object, right? And that direct object is a noun. So in my sentence diagram, I've got it laid out where Ivan's the direct object. He fills that direct object slot. But look at this next sentence. I know, subject verb, but what is the direct object here? It's not a single word, is it? It's the entire clause. That Ivan is terrible. That's what I know. So in my sentence diagram, I've got subject verb, I know, but the whole that clause is occupying the direct object slot, isn't it? In order to put it there, I have to push it up on the standard and give it its own baseline, because a nominal clause is a clause and all clauses have baselines. So this is the main clause baseline, and this is the dependent clause baseline, right? All right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, adverbial clauses are subordinate clauses as well. So remember, I said that there were basically three types of subordinate or dependent clause. So we've looked at adjectival, we've looked at nominal, and now we have adverbial. And these are introduced by subordinating conjunctions, and they serve to modify verb phrases. Okay, so, and that's what an adverb does. Adverbs modify verbs. And we can subcategorize these into a variety of semantic types. And this is what we start talking about, temporal. So if my adverbial clause is temporal in nature, what it's doing is it's giving you a time-related qualifier for the verbal action. All right. If it's causal, it's providing the grounds or the reason for the verbal action in the main clause. It could be a purpose, or it could provide a condition for the main verb. Okay. So let's look at our example here. I came yesterday. There's a simple sentence with an adverb, right? That adverb is modifying not I, but came. It's telling you when the action happened, yesterday. Yesterday relative to the time of speaking. And so in our sentence, I have subject verb, and yesterday is not an object, right? It's not a direct object. The verb came is not transitive. It doesn't take an object, it's intransitive. So this verb doesn't need an object, but it does take a modifier in the form of the adverb yesterday. Can I drop modifiers like adverbs like this? I certainly can, and the sentence will still be grammatical. I could just say, I came. And I can also indicate when I came. I came yesterday. I came last night. Right? So this window dressing is an adjunct. Now, the next sentence, I came before today arrived. This expression before today arrived is not just a simple adverb. It's a whole clause functioning like an adverb. How do I know it's a clause? Well, because today arrived is a subject and a verb, isn't it? And my subordinating conjunction is the word before. That subordinating conjunction tells me that it's a temporal sort of adverbial notion. So I came is in the same place as it is over here, right? Those are exactly the same. And yesterday hang off of the verb, so does the adverbial dependent clause. But I have this extra little step here because I want to put the subordinating conjunction on a line before I get to the to the baseline here for the subject and the verb of the dependent clause. All right, does that make sense?
Yes, Dr. Marshall, I do have a question.
Yes.
Since you're here in Huntsville. So say you replace the word yesterday in that first sentence with quickly. Quickly.
Yes.
Which of the categories above, or does it fit in the et cetera? Is it causal, purpose, temporal?
Yes, it fits in the et cetera. So this would be manner.
Manner, okay.
Right. And so what would be a manner type of dependent clause? I came like a thief comes. Right? So this dependent clause tells you how I came, the manner in which I came. Right? And so underneath the verb, I'd have like a thief comes. Right, and the mind.
I trust that you've listed the main ones, but rough idea, how many other categories of these sorts of things might we see?
Yeah, well, I'd just say a handful more. Like you've got concessive notions. Concessive notion would be something like although, right? Even though. In other words, there's the main clause and the concessive clause have a semantic relationship where the main clause is asserted in spite of the information in the concessive clause. So, you abandoned me, although I loved you, right? You abandoning me and me loving you don't seem to go together, right? It's contrary to expectation. And that's what the concessive notion is.
Okay.
We can have, your Williams syntax is going to give you a number of sorts of semantic possibilities for adverbs and adverbial clauses.
Dr. Marshall, this is Jonathan Huntsville. Do you have maybe a quick example of what a condition
Yes.
would be?
Yes. You will be saved if you persevere.
Okay.
Right? Okay, so what's the main clause?
You will be saved.
You'll be saved, right? That's the main. And then the if you persevere, that's the dependent or embedded clause, and it provides a condition, right?